Hi, everyone. Welcome. And we are really thrilled to have you here today and also to have with us Saminda Wijegunawardena. And, there's a lot of coaches out there who talk about leadership and CEOs and companies in general. But we're fortunate today to have someone who really thinks about technology leadership. And Saminda has built high performance software engineering teams at big companies like Box and Amazon and Pixar, and has coached amazing startups from Levels to Snorkel AI, Productboard, Superhuman, Abnormal Security, kind of companies across the spectrum. And um, we know how valuable it is for you to have an engineering leader and to be building your engineering leadership skills. So that's what the topic is about today. And we have a lot of content, and we won't get into everything. We won't be able to cover all the questions, but I hope this gives you a taste of the kind of topics we can have among founders in the community, but also if any of you want to follow up with Saminda, we can make that happen as well. So without further ado, welcome Saminda.
Thank you very much, Anne. It's great to be here. Thanks for the opportunity to speak to the Village Global community.
It's going to be fun. Okay, so as an engineering leader, what has worked for you to align engineering strategy and commitments to business goals?
Yeah, this is a topic that ends up coming up a lot when I've coached leaders at different levels. What I really try to emphasize with them is there has to be a real through line from the business strategy to the product strategy to the engineering strategy. So when you're talking about making engineering commitments, there has to be a connection back, whether they're engineering investments or product engineering investments, that it all starts with the business strategy. And what I mean by that is a lot of different companies can have different forms of success. You can be a high margin business, a low margin business. You can be sales led, product led. There are different kind of business identities and business constraints you can operate by. And then so when you're framing engineering commitments, having that anchor back to the business and then the product strategy makes it very much easier to prioritize and also articulate certain types of engineering only investments. And so for engineering only investments, still thinking of that the same way you think of product investments or other types of business investments in terms of business value. So when you're doing engineering commitments or engineering specific commitments, thinking in terms of what value does this bring in terms of velocity to the business, in terms of additional competitive edge or differentiation in your technical foundation, or enhanced security or any types of other types of actual business value. So framing engineering commitments for me is no different than framing other types of product engineering type of commitments in terms of finding consistent ways to articulate the value. And that comes from that connection back to the business strategy and the product strategy.
Got it. I think that that certainly resonates with me because I was not a technologist, but as a CEO of a company, I really did my first company. I didn't do so well. My second company, I made sure that every member of the team, including every IC, understood what the KPIs of the business were so that they could understand that, as you said, maybe product velocity, uptime, conversion rates, hitting deadlines were the key metrics of our business. Those were kind of like the values. And then it seemed like then engineering leadership and individual engineers would be more empowered to make decisions, the right decisions, and to frame those investments, as you said, in the things that matter to the business.
Absolutely. I think also the types of KPIs that different businesses and different technology companies can have can tell a lot about what their business strategy is and what really matters to them as like key performance indicators. Something we watched at Box because it was very inherent to our business. It was a cloud storage company. Storage is very expensive. So we paid attention to gross margin as a business indicator. And so a lot of the investments down at the product or engineering level also reflected back to how it would reflect on gross margin. So everything, that mapping of that through line can also be a KPI tree in that way of having that laddering and connectivity.
And it's also fair, it sounds like, for engineering leadership or technology leadership to ask clarifying questions of the CEO and the business team or the product team, right? To say, what are we optimizing for? Because there's often the trade-offs are what you're managing, right?
Yeah, I think trying to gain alignment which for me means a shared understanding of what those constraints and goals are that you're going to operate by, are critical to establish. Where I've seen things go wrong, especially as a company scales, is mismatched identities or sets of mismatched goals, and having identity crisis of, are we trying to deepen in a particular market or not? Are we trying to expand vertically? And that is both a business and product strategy, and can fundamentally change how you think about the technology foundation and how you're going to build it, in terms of how you're going to are you going to deepen investments in certain areas, or are you going to make it more extensible to attack new areas? So that alignment and asking those questions, especially at the senior leadership level, is really, really critical. There can be a lot of assumptions made about we're going to continue to do things the way we are versus going in a different direction. And I think the advantage of having an earlier stage startup is there's literally less people that you have to communicate with, and then there's different ways to communicate to bring them along and have those kinds of conversations. Once you've gained that alignment at the leadership level, that you can cascade that information down more effectively.
Awesome. Yeah, I mean, it seems like at the end of the day, leadership is about clarity and alignment, right? Because you can change, but if you have clarity, then you know what you're changing from and to. But let's dig into that a little bit more. Even though many startups we've backed are still pretty small, they're growing fast and they're scaling. How do you just cascade the goals throughout your team? What have you seen work?
Yeah, I find for those earlier stage companies, per the earlier point, that there is an advantage of having a smaller group, and so there's less people to communicate to, less communication channels and lines of sight. I still encourage something consistently, whether it's your small company or a larger company, is to take a multimodal approach toward cascading things. And that means I've heard over and over again from engineering leaders and product leaders that these people are confused on what we're doing or why we're doing it. But I sent an email about it. I'm like, they may or may not have read that email, but that is not going to be the thing that they're defining their day and their week, is that anchor point. So you have to really work on over communicating and penetrating in different modalities. And I mean, the all hands, the emails, the team lunches, the one-on-ones. I looked at every opportunity and every interaction to cascade context that was necessary for people to do their jobs effectively, but also to bring them into whatever journey pivot that we may be making, especially when there's changes of direction, to make sure they're bring along. So I think whether you're a 10-person startup or 100 or 1,000, being multimodal as a leader, I think, is really effective. I think that was one of my biggest learnings when I became an executive, is how much I needed to communicate, how much more I needed to communicate. The same message needs to be said 3 or 5 times before it actually penetrates a single person and really becomes resonant in them, and really as a sticky message for them.
Cool. Okay, so let's move now to building a company with operational excellence. And what do you know now about setting key metrics that you wish you'd known at the very start in order to create one of those cultures of excellence?
Yeah, I think my biggest learnings, and something that if I had to do over, I would have embraced differently early on, is getting comfortable with data much earlier on. I think the value of data, especially as you scale, becomes increasingly important. And the more familiar you can weave data-driven decision-making and working with data and using data to inform a lot of decision-making at earlier stage, you can build that muscle as an organization and as a leadership team to scale those things out. Because as you grow, if you think about the people on the ground doing the work, they're really focused on the work. And then there's management that really works on defining how they work. And at the very senior leadership level, you're defined by outcomes. Did you hit your revenue or not? Did you make your investors happy or not? They're very measurable things. And so ultimately, you have to learn to manage with that level of abstraction of data. And so getting comfortable with data to help inform your decision making is very key. And then you start to realize that beyond setting goals, like a revenue goal, having data can be used to establish things like KPIs as guardrails for the business to see if you're inbound. You mentioned uptime, right? That is a goal that you try to reach, but it's also a guardrail, meaning like you don't want to go outside of a certain bounds in there, whether you're a 3 nines company or 4 nines company. And so again, whether a 3 9 or 4 9 can set a very specific business strategy and how you're running the business to meet that goal, but that anchoring to that KPI really establish a guardrail. So you can think about it from any dimension: the number of security vulnerabilities, are you in compliance or not, the number of defects. Those are all different ways of looking at metrics for guardrails. So I find that if I could do it over, I would have embraced data earlier and found ways to incorporate data into how my teams operate, and using measurement as a fundamental way of doing things, and because it becomes a necessity as you scale.
Right. And maybe even involve the team in the discussion of the KPIs, because sometimes there are, as you said, there are trade-offs, right? And sometimes they have a sense.
Yeah, and I think that involving the team, that's a really important point. And I think you can have this notion of a KPI tree. There's high-level company goals that you're trying to meet: revenue, uptime, things like that. Understanding how everyone's part fits into that as part of that cascading, that multimodal messaging, explaining the why and the through line, so people understand why their work matters. But then defining local KPIs are really, really important for different product areas. There are different types of KPIs that are meaningful for the product and that part of the tech stack as well. So I think empowering individuals by embracing data-driven thinking and decision making allows them to also come up with their local KPIs and see the value of that, versus it just being cascaded down from a top level. So I think that's an important piece that you're mentioning, is making sure the team is involved in defining what are the local KPIs for our team, our part of the product, that make a lot of sense, that we are going to kind of live and die by, from in terms of like our guardrails, the North Star metrics for the teams. Those are really, really important.
Okay. And you've seen what good looks like at some of these companies that have both scaled fast, had excellent product, excellent business results. Can you share a story of how specifically it came together? Can you break down the key elements?
Yeah, I think this is where it's going to seem a little self-serving, because my measure of success of people that have adopted similar frameworks as mine, I would say, is the best way I could put it. And there was a framework that I used at Box, and I'll start there. And it's something that I developed over time. Some of my team members called it the 3P framework. And the 3Ps are for people, product, and process, and the T's for technical. And those became kind of 4 quadrants there. And where I've seen startups think and start to operate that way, that all of those dimensions are important in terms of developing operational excellence, because you can set up measures for each of those areas. For the people side, it's hiring, it's manager effectiveness, employee engagement. For technical, it's uptime, it's crash rate of your clients if you have a mobile app. For process, it's your agile metrics, your quality metrics, things like that. And then on the product side, product usage metrics, adoption, retention, those kinds of things are really important, right? And so when you take a comprehensive view and apply that across the board, that's where I've seen operational excellence develop. You cannot have operational excellence without data and metrics. And when you establish a comprehensive view of that, and so I've worked with clients to do that, but I've seen clients that already had some maturity in that area built in early in the company at seed or Series A. They start to operate that way, and they don't have a lot of metrics, but they have a diverse set of metrics that are comprehensive and give you kind of a look at a heterogeneous organization and how it operates. And the other part that's really important of operational excellence is people that have woven in elements of continuous improvement. So one startup in mind that has done this really well is every process they did, they were very attentive to also some of my input in terms of making sure there were feedback loops. So if you just even look at the agile process, you plan a sprint, you execute a sprint, and you retrospect. That's a continuous feedback loop. And having those woven in to everything. So when we were doing hiring, I would make sure that they would have, when they were doing a new role, they would have a calibration or a retrospective, and there would be a tuning of the process, especially for new roles, to make sure they're calibrated properly. So putting in the right types of comprehensive KPIs is a part of operational excellence, the things you can manage to drive to and keep you on the road and successful in terms of guardrails. But the other thing is a continuous improvement feedback loop woven into all these local levels and the global levels. Even at the company level, there should be a feedback loop between you build a product, you go to market with it. What is that feedback loop back from customers, all the way from CS and marketing and so forth, back to inform the product? If you're just building product and releasing it and don't have that product loop, you have a very fragmented set of functions, and that's going to spell disaster over time if your go-to-market teams are not communicating effectively with your product team. That's also a feedback loop that allows continuous improvement iteration to make sure you're meeting the needs of the customer, both in the current and the future.
I love it. It's funny because your words make me think of someone who's very early at Meta, or it's Facebook, now Meta. And he said, we realized about a year into the hyperscaling that the product was the metrics, meaning they were trying to manufacture metrics. Now, that didn't mean that they didn't care about user experience, but they were trying to build a machine in the product organization, in the technology organization, that would deliver and surpass metric targets, which is just an interesting way to think about it, and actually kind of cool for an engineer.
Yeah, I think there's that kind of exposes the recursive nature of the metrics importance, right? Even if that you're going to measure the value of the metrics that you're going to bring itself, right? That those themselves are going to have targets and bounds that you're going to try to achieve.
Awesome. Okay, so and what did the operating excellence companies that you've been at, what didn't they do? What did they avoid doing?
Yeah, the thing where I've seen the anti patterns developed, and similar client to the one I described that was headed in the right direction, but got caught up more in the how to measure versus what the key things to measure are. It's a little bit of analysis paralysis, but they're spending more time on how we should measure something versus the actual measurement. And so that kind of took away from the actual getting to the value of the measurements in terms of giving you an indicator that you needed to. So I would say that that's an important thing to pay attention to. Is it's more important to get a metric and start to calibrate against that metric versus figuring out the three different ways you can arrive at the metric. I'm not saying to rush into flawed metrics, but you should have validity, statistical significance, depending on what you're trying to do. But ultimately, I've seen a lot of spinning on trying to get to consensus on how you're going to measure something versus actually trying to get the measurement versus getting the measurement and looking at it and seeing what it tells you. Because you can refine metrics over time, but getting to that starting point is really important. The other thing is, there's been a lot of discussion recently around some of this stuff in terms of developer productivity metrics and things like that. One of the things that's interesting is to understand that the metric doesn't tell you the whole story necessarily. It's a starting point often. So there are these DORA metrics that have become very popular to track and report on over the year. They're based on things like change failure rate and deployment frequency, lead time. These are empirical measures where the DORA folks research tons of technology organizations and found high rates of success in these areas correlated with high performance, typically both from an internal perception and outward impact. So they're important metrics. But if your change failure rate is low, meaning every time you push a change onto production, how likely it is to fail, that's not going to tell you why it's happening. There's going to be typically upstream problems around your testing, your requirements gathering, your definition, your deployment process itself. So it's a lagging indicator and it's an abstraction indicator. So I think over-reliance on metrics without digging into them and actioning on them and figuring out what the root causes that are driving a metric to go one way or another, that's really important. So I think that's why I also emphasize getting some metrics in place to start to look at them and see what they tell you versus debating on, is this the best way to actually measure it? Getting something in place so you can start to investigate and action on it is really important. The companies that have failed to do that or fall into the traps of just relying on the metrics without thinking about what's going on behind them is
A cause.
a
Great.
cause. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay, so you've led very high performance cultures, but that can be a challenge, right? Because how can leaders foster excellence without side effects like burnout?
Yeah, I mean, this is an ongoing concern for any startup, right? There's always more than you can do. You're always strapped with resources. There's a large appetite in terms of what you could build, either to test product market fit or once you have it, to deepen it and expand on it. My notion around this is, one, you have to really have a strong pulse on your team members, and as your organization grows, you have to have pulses through super nodes that give you sense of the broader organization. So I believe in monitoring engagement continuously versus doing a survey once a year that kind of tells you after the fact that things are really bad versus kind of polling in real time. So I have this 1 to 5 pulse question that I ask if I was ever doing a skip level with an engineer or a manager or what have you, to try to get a pulse of how someone's doing that day. So if I would tell them to answer on a scale of 1 to 5, this morning when you got up this is when people used to go to work, but now start work. how did you feel? Where you want to, and one is like you're burying your head under the cover. You don't want to face the day. You don't want to face your coworkers. You don't want to face the work in front of you. And a 5 is you're bouncing out of bed, excited for the day, excited to tackle the work, the people around you, or rejuvenate you, give you energy. So the answer is important, as you can imagine. I won't go into too much detail initially, but what I would try to find out is why they gave the score that they did. And if it was a lower score, what would move it up half a point? Not what would move it from a 2 to a 5, but move it from like a 2 to 2.5. Like what's one thing? And I would try to give them some value. So it's like attending to engagement constantly and eliminating friction where you can, that the person is countering on a daily or weekly basis, versus doing a pulse survey once a year and getting a large amount of data that's stale as soon as you read it is really important. So doing these regular pulse checks, I think, are really important to foster excellent performance, because without high engagement, there isn't motivation, and without motivation, you cannot have strong performance, and you're going to have burnout, right? You're going to I think you continuously attending to areas like engagement, developer experience, culture, morale, workload, and measurements in those areas in all different forms, real-time measurements like the one I mentioned, as well as any kind of abstractions, all will give you a sense of how the organization is feeling and doing while they're trying to do their
Yeah.
best work. So I think you can always drive for high performance, but you have to have also these other kinds of guardrails in place of checking to see if engagement is eroding, burnout is emerging. Because once burnout starts to emerge, it's very hard to unwind. It's very hard. If someone's
Yeah.
giving you 1 or 2 on that pulse score, that's like 6 to 12 months, they're gone at the earliest kind of thing, at the latest. So you have to really
Yeah.
pay attention to engagement on an ongoing basis.
I love that. And, it's interesting because, just thinking about what you were talking about with metrics too, is sometimes progress towards goals, even if you're not fully succeeding, but progress towards goals can be quite motivating in itself, right? So, and can be quite engaging, even if it's tough. But let's talk a little bit. We have some questions from folks out there. So one, Mulk says, we have great and ambitious team members, and many of them want to have a leadership role. But realistically, we can't give everybody a leadership role. How can he make them happy and, maintain that level of ambition?
Yeah, I think that's a good problem to have, I would say. I've seen the opposite problem where no one wants to go into management, and that's what they're saying. I would say leadership roles, it's a broad role. I think everyone can lead in different ways. You can lead as an IC, and I think this notion of only getting into leadership means going on the manager track is a misnomer. I think it's important to debunk that. So I would always look to create leadership opportunities at different level. For entry level engineer, that means leading a small project. For a senior engineer, it means leading a much larger project and mentoring people below them on how to do that. Those are all forms of leadership. So I think there is a set of skills you have in management, and there's a set of skills you have in as an IC, and leadership in those areas. There's a fungible intersection of skills that you can cultivate. So I don't think you should manufacture management roles just because people want to become manager. It has to fit a business need. It has to fit the needs, like the right manager IC ratios, the organizational growth that you're projecting, things like that. But you can always cultivate leadership skills, especially on the IC track. That's you do it by influence. You do it by providing the right technical supervision and guidance and direction. You do it by mentoring. You do it by having a larger company hat, wearing a larger company hat in terms of as a leader, thinking from a company perspective versus just a purely an engineering perspective. So I felt like I relied much more increasingly. I really value the management team. They were there to help the teams uh, run, operate, and optimize. But a lot of the change agents, when we were trying to go through transformative changes, those came from the ICs. All right. So those were the
That's right.
leaders I looked to help make the transformative change, because they stirred everything. And they did it with influence and impact in a different way as an IC than a manager typically would have done by implicit or explicit authority.
That's a big idea because the unit of work kind of is the project, right? Like we're not just turning cranks anymore. It's like not the same old stuff. We're often like, here's a new initiative, right? You frame it up and you kind of accomplish it, scope it, and then move on to the next one. It's pretty, even more satisfying. And let's talk a little bit about developer productivity. So, Yassine asks, at what stage in engineering time size should a company start monitoring and measuring developer productivity?
Mm-hmm. So this is similar to kind of my thoughts around the data aspect, meaning getting comfortable with thinking about it versus necessarily having a multifaceted dashboard in a 3-person startup. Doesn't make a ton of sense, but um, because it's such a small surface area. I think there's been a lot of discussion of late on LinkedIn, other things with the McKinsey framework, which is a synthesis of the DORA metrics, the SPACE framework, and some of their own additional input into coming up with this one framework to rule them all in terms of measuring developer productivity. A lot of it is aimed for larger organizations. And so to the point of the question of when to start thinking about it, I think early on, it's important to pay attention to certain elements of developer productivity. At an earlier stage company, seed Series A, it's looking at the development environment. It's looking at paying attention to a guardrail of how much focus time there is for developers so they can get into a flow state and be their most productive and most in tune. I would pay what is a telltale sign if I look at a developer's calendar just to inspect and I see a lot of fragmented meetings, I'm like, they're not going to be productive. It's not about the sum of the individual time. It's how much contiguous blocks they have to do deep work. So those are all related to developer activity. So you don't have to take 40 KPIs from like the McKinsey framework or some of these space frameworks or so forth, or put in a tool like Swarmy or Jellyfish. Some of those things can be helpful over time, to be clear. They have a lot of value in measuring a lot of things, like cycle time, lead time, et cetera. But starting to think about what is the developer experience like? How quickly can they get their environment set up? How quickly can they or how much time are they spending waiting for the computer? How much focus time? Those are things you can act on at a 10-person startup and making sure that you're productive as possible. It's so just like the data-driven decision making, it's about building the habit early so then you can extend and scale the habit later. Right? It's much harder to build habits when you're 50, 60 people than you are when you're 5 or 10 people.
Love it. Okay, so your skip level comment generated some questions. Specifically, how frequent do you do skip level one-on-ones? And
Mm.
what are any rituals to set up so you get the pulse of the org on a regular basis?
That's a great question. So I think that I can answer it from managing hundreds of people a box kind of question, but that gives you a sense of the upper bounds. What I would do is if your engineering team is sub 10 people, you should be talking. If you're the head of engineering or a leader in the engineering group in that way, you should be talking to everyone once a week. Right? Like you can afford to do that and just check in. They don't have to be long conversations, but these pulse check conversations to get a sense of tempo, morale, how things are going. I would invest in that, right? As you're getting to like your engineering org is in that 20 to 50 range, you have to start to prioritize. So on my upper bounds, let's say hundreds of engineers, I would ask each director, each person in a group to give me generally tops, like what are the top people I should be checking with, the change engines and influences, the top performance, the critical retain folks. But also I would talk to some tails, people that weren't having a great time, or see if there was some truth that I needed to understand what was going on there, right? So I would mix it up a little bit, but I would get a sample and a different sample each quarter or so to talk through. And I would just be having a number of one-on-ones each week alongside the other commitments that I had on my calendar that I had to maintain. So in terms of I would generally do as many as you can. You don't want to bombard them, but if you're talking to people once a week, that's ideal that you can, that are critical. And then the people that you need to talk to, if you're not talking to them, if you're talking to them once a month, that's often sufficient at a larger size to keep a sense if you're doing the right kind of sampling.
Cool. And then just how often do you revisit compensation, and that could be cash or equity on your teams?
Yeah, and I'm sorry, there was a rituals question as well. I'm sorry, tied to the one-on-ones. I don't
Oh,
know if I
yes, I'm so
forgot
sorry.
about that.
Well, I think you addressed it. I think you addressed it, which is, you basically as many as you can weekly. It's unless there are some rituals that are top of mind for you.
Well, for the other teams that keep in pulse with the team, I would teach. One thing I can mention really quickly, we can move on to the other question, is every 2 weeks I did kind of my all hands for the group, but it was just cross team demos. But it was a way to
Yeah.
interact with the team all at once together, and you could really get like an organizational sense of like how motivated or demotivated the team was. I would look for certain energy levels, how much they brought into that. So at a group level, you can kind of do a different kind of pulse check. So that was another ritual. So the question, sorry, if you could go back to the last question you were about to.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. And I was going to say, I love this idea of the cross team demos. I mean, my most successful thing as a early stage CEO was to have Friday afternoons. We would use usertesting.com to actually go through different components of the product with the product and engineering teams. And it was amazing how many like user issues got fixed by Monday because people were so frustrated, like seeing the product, in
Yeah,
action,
yeah.
or brainstorming how to solve stuff. But just the question was, how often did you revisit compensation, cash, and equity for developers in your org or people
Yeah,
in
I
your
think
org?
at early stage, you're probably going to look at it more frequently than at a later stage or post IPO type of company. At a large company, you're looking at compensation once a year, from a broad level. But in terms of the kind of compensation conversations you might be getting into with engineers or team members, I would generally try to engage with them whenever they wanted to engage about it. But I would not necessarily open the conversation unless there was a way to take action on that myself, right? If I was opening a conversation. So um, I think uh, I've seen companies be very liberal with compensation adjustments and equity adjustments throughout the year in terms of an ad hoc. I encourage them to build a cycle around this, like a predictive cycle around this earlier than they might think for a couple of reasons. One, it's the pattern you will get into, and it's building the habit earlier. But it also avoids these one-off kind of adjustments of the squeaky wheel getting the most oil kind of thing. The person that's coming up and complaining and doing, I've seen this, and they're like, they've done 2 compensation adjustments already this year. I'm like, that's a bad pattern to set because you've set that precedent. And no matter how much you think they're going to keep confidentiality, people talk about there. So then you've started to create a snowball effect of that, setting that expectation that you can renegotiate your compensation all the time. And that's really not how it should work. It's like should be an expectation around, we're going to review this twice a year or once a year at later stage, looking at your compensation and looking at the market rate, looking at your merit, meaning how well you performed, looking at your long-term value in terms of retention value, which is really what maps to equity. Equity is a long-term retention vehicle. It should not be thinking of as a short-term stopgap in my mind. So knowing the levers you have, they should be used equitably, and getting into a predictable cycle early sets a uniformity and a sense of fairness, to be honest with you, that you're not the person that's the noisiest is not going to get the most attention and the most compensation in certain cases, that where they're going to hold the company hostage by threatening to quit. I generally believe you shouldn't be held hostage by anyone because it can start to violate those principles of fairness for the rest.
Yeah, that's awesome. Okay, and Chris Mitchell asked, we find our smartest engineers are most motivated by solving hard problems, but lag during that final 20% of fine tuning and productizing tech. How do you think about maintaining momentum all the way through?
Yeah, there are 2 schools of thought around this. And I can tell you that in my cynical old age, I don't have a strong bias in either one. But what I will put out there is there's one that you should constantly try to impart on those types of engineers, that they have to own the whole thing, the whole life cycle, and think through it and not lose momentum, and try to explain the value of doing the adjustments, the refinements, the polish. And finish on it, whether it's performance or security or things that may be drudgery to them, or writing additional test cases, those things they may shy away from, that there's value, there's business value for the customer in all of these things that you do it, or there's risk to business if you don't. So that should be something you shy away from. But I would also say that if there's a fundamental high value of them being a very much 0 to 1 person, like they do it better than most other people, and there's an inverse value that they add, it's almost net negative on the final stages, then it's about creating a complementary team or project where someone is the starter and someone is the finisher, and they can work really well together. So I've seen a lot of great pairings, not just in terms of pair programming, but on projects where some folks are really good on the front end design, architecture standpoint, but they're not really good on the details and hygiene. Other people are really good on the tail end there. So you can have complementary pairings. Those are things that can be very effective at an early stage startup as well. So those are the two modes. I don't think they're necessarily mutually exclusive. More that sometimes a recognition, if the former isn't working, you might have to think about the latter, and you might think about the latter anyway as a good model for a particular set of people and how they work.
Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so let's get tactical. Um, What separates great one-on-one meetings for managers from average ones?
So I think in terms of one-on-ones, I still run into this quite a lot where I'll get collect feedback from somebody I'm coaching, and they'll give feedback about difficult one-on-ones, or the one-on-ones aren't terrific. And when I decompose what's happening, this actually happened a couple weeks ago with a few managers I spoke to on behalf of a client, and the one-on-ones were clearly structured so the manager was the customer, meaning the person, not the team member that they're having the one-on-one, but the manager is the customer. They're getting status. They're asking questions. They're doing design brainstorms. They're doing other things that are obviously valuable in a sense, but it's not the right form, in my opinion. The one-on-ones uh, are the team member is the customer. So everything I would do in a one-on-one was oriented around them. I can get status on Slack, on Jira, in stand-ups, in dashboards, and other types of project review meetings and forums. So that's not a place I want to get status. But what I would try to do the one-on-one is use it as an opportunity to, one, unblock the individual if they were having some friction. That sometimes the pulse check questions would reveal what those impediments are for friction. But sometimes there'd be you just realizing the person needs a day off. They need a 3-day weekend to recharge, right? Or sometimes it was just getting something done for them that they were having trouble influencing because of their seniority or what have you. So unblocking was one area that I would always cover. And the other two parts are just the engagement, like how they're doing, the pulse check questions sometimes, but also just seeing how they're doing with a particular project, a new team member, a new structure. And then the last thing was just fundamental was coaching. It was an opportunity to coach. And so for me, it was giving feedback, constructive feedback, working on their development goals that they have put in place. That's not necessarily not every one-on-one, but the heart of it was really around coaching and trying to improve performance and improve engagement. And by part of doing that was unblocking them and making sure that they had a place to talk to about personal blockers and things that were coming up in their work that were not tied to like a project blocker per se or something like that would come up in a different form.
Cool. Yeah, no, I love that reframing of it's really for them. It's not for you, right, as a manager. Okay. And Nitin asks, how can we encourage engineers to focus on one task at a time while maintaining morale, especially when many are inclined to explore multiple interests they find exciting?
Yeah, I think I'm just flashing to a lot of different engineers that I've seen demonstrate this in a way. Um, I think if this is a broader problem, which is like engineers represents like a larger set of engineers in a group, they're having trouble doing this. It might be organizational. If that's the symptom, it might be an organizational issue. If it's about a handful of engineers that are more this flavor of engineer has trouble focusing on one task, I think a lot of it is hopefully part of it is creating the right environment, the focus time, the free of distractions, interruptions. But I think a lot of this is around putting in also team-based processes around we have a set of goals in a sprint. Everyone has a piece to play in that. And these are your commitments you're making to your peers on what you're going to get done. So peer motivation, peer alignment on goal setting and what they should be focusing on sprint to sprint will do that. Now, I think this is harder. I think it's easier. I found that post-COVID in a remote work type of setting, this tends to happen more often where people will go off because there isn't the organic visibility that you have, even if you have stand-up set in place, et cetera. Not that you're monitoring everything in an in-person office with high telemetry or something like that. Should you try? But people tend to wander off in their remote settings more, and it's less perceptible even to teammates. It's sometimes happening. So some of that takes direct coaching about getting them and finding out, is there things that are contributing to it, distractions, interruptions, unclear priorities. They're feeling like they have 3 managers, a product manager asking them to do something, a senior engineer asking them to do something. Like, what is the root cause of this? And then you can maybe solve it that way if it's environmental. If it's behavioral, then you have to really coach on them developing focus, try to make it easier for them, build the right environment, but really set expectations that this is what you need to do. Otherwise, you're holding back the business in terms of our commitments that we need to focus on, right? So tying these back to broader peer-based goals, team-level goals can often help. So there can be a lot of different ways you can tackle this problem, and I think it depends on what that root cause is for that particular engineer or group of engineers.
Love that. And I love this idea of celebrating the success that they deliver, meaning coming up with some new idea is less celebrated, like some random exploration is less celebrated than, hey, you got that project priority done.
Yeah, I would also
I
say
really
that, like for certain teams, it's not summer camp. We're running a business. We have customers.
Yep.
This people will want. I think early days in Box, there were certain engineers we encountered that were trying to open source everything, which is great. You're trying to open source with them, but there's actual customers you have within the business, whether you're a developer or experienced team that you're supporting other developers, so forth, that you need to actually focus on as well, right? So getting the customer orientation is really important. That these interests might be exciting as a potential opportunity. It's also finding time when to explore those interests, like doing spikes, investigations in later sprints, creating time for them, but keeping them focused. I always tie it back to the team company goals. And if there's a behavioral issue that keeps coming up that's preventing them from doing it, you have to address that as well.
Cool. And Vivian raises a canonical question, which is, I'm sure you have a great perspective on, which is how do you balance engineering initiatives like unit testing and load testing and stuff like that against the business initiatives like, going live fast or new feature requests, even, like how are you making those trade-offs and prioritizations?
Yeah, I think some of this I was alluding to earlier in terms of when you're making engineering commitments, whether they're for the business as product commitments or engineering investments, they all have to be articulated in business value. So I believe in a lot of agile principles. Like one is the notion of a unified backlog, that you don't have a sandbox back for tech debt and developer fixes, and it's 10% fixed amount of time, because that allows you uh, uh, to follow a pattern of behavior that you always constrain the investment, even if it's the making the engineering specific investments on quality or technical debt of some form is a higher business value investment. I'll give you one example from Box really quickly, which is we had a product called Box Notes, which is like Google Docs or Notion, like a real-time collaborating note-taking tool. And it was built on a real old editor. The developers have been wanting to replace the editor for a long time. When I got involved with the group, the way we articulated the product team is we looked at the product roadmap on the things they needed to be built and showed them the speed at which we could build it on the current editor or the new editor. The new editor, you got a bunch of features for free, so there was almost zero time. And then other things got built a lot faster because of the environment and the maturity of the editor. As a result, the product team wanted to completely punt the product backlog for a quarter to focus on the editor because they saw the speed of the velocity gains we get. So my point is that not thinking them as separate things, they're all related to how fast we can deliver value to the customer. So quality is about ensuring that what you're delivering in a timely manner is going to be what the customer expects. It's defect free, it's free of vulnerabilities, it's performant, et cetera. So articulating the need for those things shouldn't be in a separate way. You should tie back to business value. This is going to improve security for the customer. This is going to improve performance for the customer. This is going to improve user experience for the customer. This is going to translate into developer hours saved. This is going to this is going to impact our gross margin positively. Whatever those things are, articulating in business value so that you can measure against the product investments and have them have a common language to talk about those things. That was a really important epiphany for me of like, the only reason you pay down tech debt in all forms is to increase innovation velocity. Otherwise, it's engineering for its own sake. It's chasing exciting interest, but it's not really tied to what you're trying to do as a business. Now, the union, when you find the intersection of those things, of like things that help the business and are cool and fun to do, that's great. That's what you always strive for. But doing some of these things that need to happen, unit testing, infra, et cetera, they're all part of keeping the business going and performant. Early on, I favor product market fit, but over time, you have to balance those investments by looking at it in terms of business value.
Right, right. No, that's well put. In the beginning, product market fit is king, and I remember being an early stage startup and said, we write code. There's another thing we call that is tech debt, future tech debt, like
Mm-hmm.
meaning like we knew it was going to come along. Okay, so Anoop expresses a question which is quite common as companies are scaling and they get bigger and they feel like they get slower. So he asks, how do we increase velocity of the engineering team? And are there any tactics to make velocity a company value?
Yeah, I think these are great questions. And the person answering the question, asking the question, kind of answered it in a way for me. It's like making it a company value is how you can help increase velocity of the engineering team. Meaning, if there's a laddering effect of the company level metrics and goals all the way down to individuals. So one CEO, there's a technical founder that was CEO that I was coaching, and had oriented the team around they built synthetic data for consumption by some lighthouse customers, and the notion that they rallied the whole company around was time to data, how quickly they could get data to the customer.
Mm.
That had a whole set of implications for the entire company. They had a services side that worked on helping the company digest this data and making it more seamless for them. And then there was a bunch of interdisciplinary teams that were involved in the pipeline to generate the data, the synthetic data. So everything started to orient around this North Star metric, time to data. So in making it a company value, actually now you have a sale that pushes the entire kind of company along in terms of that direction. So I think there was a point in Box where I was pushing really for a lot of typical SaaS companies, very revenue led. So the top level OKRs were always about revenue, ARR, very typical, and those are important. But we had very little product led type of metrics like usage, adoption, things like that, user growth goals overall, right? And so having those goals are really important because they really reorient the company. So velocity, I would think about what is the North Star kind of metric for the company or the value. And so it's less a value, but a metric, and how you can anchor that. And so then that would lead to everyone thinking down to individual level, how can I be faster at what I'm doing and more effective and efficient, right? So that might be about changing the structure of our meetings at a company level, right? Like how we work and getting in sync and cadence so there's less impedance. Like when you see things like no meeting days to have more velocity and focus time, that's great if everyone is following that. When no one's following that, there's impedance and collisions at different levels. So getting aligned on these top level metrics can cascade down ways of working, policies, processes that enable reaching that metric collectively. So I think that's a great question. The answer is right there in the question for me.
Yeah, and I love this idea of, especially as you grow, creating your custom KPI, right? Like, yeah, ARR, great, fine, that's going to be a metric, but what is the root cause or what is the time to data metric for your company that really defines, your success and capability? Paulo asks, what's the best way to monitor or measure performance of a remote or distributed engineering team without making them feel scrutinized or undermining trust?
Yeah, I think there was right after COVID hit and it was pretty much all remote work. Where there's a business problem, there's often a technical solution. There were a lot of tools that came out that were like very big brother kind of tools that you could start to monitor people's activities on laptops. I don't think that ultimately builds the right culture, right? So it undermines trust, as the question implies. So I think having really concrete, well-aligned goals for the team and over their commitments that they're hitting, whether they're OKRs or they're just time-based initiatives tied with quality measures. So you can deliver something fast, but with poor quality. But what you want to try to do is deliver something timely and more predictably, but with high quality, right? So again, you establish success measures for the group, and then that's how you would measure the performance. Here's your mission. Here's your charter. Here's what you're responsible for. Here's what you're given to reach success, and here's how we're going to measure success. And so building that data-driven mindset from the beginning makes measurement of the performance. So it's less about now if you're getting down to individual levels, that becomes a lot more qualitative as well in terms of seeing if how engineers are engaging with one another. Are they contributing to the larger whole? Are they getting their personal tasks done on time? Those things like stand-ups, looking at other metrics in relation to how much time things are taking to cycle through. You can look at that as well, right? For down to individuals potentially, but I think as a whole for team, you can use from an extraction standpoint that you're not there. You look at, are they hitting their commitments or not? And if they're hitting or surpassing their committing, they're having good performance or high performance in that aim. So that's what I would always base it on.
Awesome. And this is awesome. You're so good at this. How would you handle underperformers?
Yeah, I think this is something that I wasn't very good at very early on, and it was very counterintuitive for me. I'm kind of embarrassed to say this, but it was really the CEO at Box, it was more, about a decade ago, that really imparted on me we were doing a book club at Box, actually, some of the leadership team. And one of the discussion points was around, you spend more time with your uh, 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 top performers and low performers. But I was like, I've always typically end up spending more time with low performers, trying to invest in them, getting them coaching. But the reality is the top performers want more constructive feedback, want more coaching, and you don't want to have a disproportionate level of investment with underperformance. So my thought in terms of underperformance is, one of my learnings is to address it promptly. Like, you don't want to overinvest. You want to ensure expectations are communicated very clearly to the person that's underperforming. Like, this is what's expected of your role at your level in this time frame. And give clear examples, tangible examples, like avoid ambiguous language, things like that. And you want to coach to performance, but not to a disproportionate level. If you have 10 people and 9 people are doing well and a few people are doing great, you don't want to spend a disproportionate time with that one person, because now you're sacrificing the massive development opportunity you have with the rest of the group that by spending that amount of time. So you always want to be conscious of the trade-offs. I would say that if you've done all the things in terms of coaching performance effectively, like you're addressing it properly, setting expectations, finding out root causes for what's driving underperformance and trying to help them where you can, but ultimately it's up for them to address those areas with some coaching. Then it's about not letting things fester after that, not letting things linger, because it impacts the whole group. Morale sinks. The bar for performance is that perception is lowered, because if like that person isn't pulling their weight and they seem to be still hanging around, why do I need to be working so hard, right? So keeping underperformers around along can have a really larger effect than their own underperformance. It has a collateral effect, and that's
Yeah.
something that was for me. Took longer for me in my management career. I was probably halfway through my management career before it fully set in that I was spending too much time trying to coach for underperformance and spending time there and spending too long doing it.
That's a really big takeaway. Most of your time should be going to top performers, not underperformers. And
Yep,
if it's a time sink, you gotta cut bait. Yeah, that's really
absolutely.
interesting. Um, uh, Okay. Well, last question, and again, we so appreciate your time. But Max asks, can you share examples of times you incubated special or strategic projects and how you
Mm.
executed them? Did you pick a single person or a small team to work on the initial scoping and the idea maturation?
It's a great question. I love this question in a couple of different levels. So for special projects, incubated, like you're trying to prove something out, like a new product feature or a new potential line of the business or something like that. I think the size of investment really depends on what you have to work with and the complexity of the type of thing you're trying to do. Can it be done with one person? Sometimes some initial work can be done with some person to prototype something, but to get to really validate with the customer, you need to semi-productionalize it in some ways, be on a prototype. You might get through a prototype design feedback, some behavioral kind of feedback on how the user experience feels, depending on what you're building. But to get something in terms of real, is it going to integrate well? Is it going to perform well? Is it going to actually fit in terms of a workflow? You have to build something to a certain production level of quality, even an incubation standpoint. At that point, it's really not about the technology you use. So I would say it's like getting to product market fit within a larger company. That's the way I would look at something as an incubator. And I think the you can do certain types of things within the context of other work. You can do spikes or investigations within a sprint to test out something you may try later before you actually tackle it. But I think one of the things in terms of a small team, if you end up doing a small team later on to really get this to a level that you can deliver to the customer and validate it, I believe in cross-functional teams for this nature. At larger scale, you might have functional teams like back-end teams, mobile teams, people grouped up like that. But when you're trying to get something out to market quickly and incubate something, I believe in building a cross-functional team together. So when we built Box's first graph, which is used for a lot of different use cases, it's like a graph, like Meta's graph, or obviously not to that level of scale or in terms of number of edges, but the intersection of all of Box's content across 100,000 enterprises, 50 million users. There's a lot of edges in that graph, and so to do that, we built a cross-functional team of data science, machine learning, mobile, web front end, distributed back end skills, and work together. And we were working much faster as a cross-functional team. Same way I encourage in terms of organizational design as an early company, keep your team monolithic and keep your tech stack monolithic. There's no need to over-engineer things there, and you want the team to work together because it collapses dependencies, and it allows you to focus on a single goal together versus on your separate sub-disciplines that you in your team. So I think that what I would say is the best way to execute from a team perspective, but there's different ways you can sequence it, having an individual doing different investigations.
Well, Saminda, thank you so much.
That went fast.
Expertise, and you're so articulate and clear. Yeah, well, it flew by. And we will make sure that everyone has your contact information so they can follow up with you, because you really are one of one in terms of providing tremendous expertise and wise counsel to people building great technology companies. So thank you again, Saminda, and thank you all for coming.
My pleasure. Thank you, Ann. Thank you, everyone, for coming.
Take care.